She had just finished another long day at work when it happened. One moment, she was organizing her desk, preparing to head home, and the next, she was summoned into her boss's office. The words came out quickly, almost like they had been rehearsed. "We're letting you go," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any empathy. She stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in her ears. Fired. After years of dedication, countless late nights, and sacrifices that had cost her friendships and family time, it all came down to this one sentence. The shock hit like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless. She was barely able to process the magnitude of what was happening. Was it real? Was this some sort of cruel joke? Her mind raced as the reality of her situation sank in. Without warning, her boss continued, outlining the terms of her severance and the paperwork she needed to sign. But the words felt distant, like they were being spoken underwater. She couldn't focus. Her hands trembled as she glanced at the door, but something inside her kept her rooted to the spot. She hadn't expected this. Nobody ever expects to be told they're no longer needed, especially when they've given so much of themselves to a company. Was this the result of the mistakes she had made in her personal life? Or was this something bigger? Before she knew it, she was handed the severance papers, the last tangible link to the job she had given everything to. The weight of it all started to settle in her chest. She was being discarded. The walk out of the office was a blur. She hardly noticed the looks from colleagues who barely glanced up from their desks. Did they know? Did they see what had just happened? Outside, the evening sky loomed heavy, mirroring the weight that pressed on her shoulders. The cold air felt sharp against her skin as she stood on the street, unsure of where to go next. The world felt different now. But as she stood there, something unusual happened. A strange thought flickered in her mind. This wasn't the end. No, something told her that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. Someone, was out there, waiting to offer her a chance that would shock not just her, but everyone around her. And she had no idea how this chance would come, but it was coming. Part 2, the mysterious offer. The following days were a blur of uncertainty. She spent hours sitting in her small apartment, staring at the phone, waiting for calls that never came. Her savings were dwindling, and the job market seemed cold, unforgiving. Each rejection email only added to the growing knot of fear in her stomach. She couldn't help but question herself. Was she not good enough? Had she truly given her best? It was on the third night of this restless cycle that the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and instinctively, she almost let it go to voicemail. But something stopped her. She picked up the phone, her heart racing. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. "Is this the woman who was recently let go from her job?" The voice on the other end was calm, almost unnervingly so. There was a hint of authority behind it, but no warmth, no sympathy. "Yes, who is this?" she asked, her curiosity beginning to outweigh her caution. Was this another job offer? A recruiter? Maybe they had heard about her firing and wanted to offer something better? "My name is Mr. Thompson," the voice continued. "I represent a group of individuals who have been watching your career for some time now. We were quite impressed by your dedication and work ethic. We have a proposition for you." The words hung in the air, strange and cryptic. She felt an odd mixture of caution and intrigue building inside her. Who would watch her career? She wasn't someone special, just another worker trying to get by. "Proposition?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of proposition?" "You'll find out soon enough," Mr. Thompson replied. "Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the cafe on 5th and Maple. I'll explain everything." Before she could ask more questions, the line went dead. She stared at the phone for several moments, the silence swallowing the space around her. What had just happened? Her mind raced as she wondered who this person was and why they had reached out to her. She didn't know whether to feel excited or uneasy. A part of her warned her to stay cautious, but another part, a much stronger part, urged her to take this chance. After all, what did she have to lose? The next morning, she found herself standing outside the cafe at 9:55 a.m., her nerves on edge. The cafe was quiet at this hour, a few patrons sipping coffee, their conversations barely above whispers. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, scanning the room for the person who had called her. A tall man in a dark suit sat at a corner table, his face unreadable as he glanced up at her entrance. He motioned for her to sit down. She hesitated for just a second, then walked over and took a seat across from him. "I'm glad you came," Mr. Thompson said. "We don't have much time, so I'll get straight to the point. You've been given an opportunity that very few people ever get, an opportunity to leave your past behind and step into a world much bigger than you could ever imagine." She blinked, unsure how to react. This was nothing like she had expected. "What do you mean? What is this about?" "I can't say too much right now, but we can offer you a new life, a fresh start. All you need to do is follow our lead, and your future will unfold in ways you can't yet comprehend." She searched his face for any signs of a lie, but there were none. There was no deceit, no hidden agenda in his eyes, just an overwhelming sense of certainty. The words hit her like a wave, and she felt both terrified and exhilarated. Could this be real? Could she actually trust this man? Or was this another one of those empty promises, a dangerous trap disguised as hope? But deep down, she felt it, a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing her into this strange, mysterious offer. It was as though she had been waiting for something like this her entire life. "How do I know this isn't some kind of scam?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Thompson smiled, a faint, knowing smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You don't. But you'll have to trust me, or you can walk away right now. The choice is yours." She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She thought of all the missed opportunities, the countless doors that had been slammed shut in her face. This could be the chance she had been waiting for. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady now, the decision made. "I'll do it." Mr. Thompson nodded, his smile widening just slightly. "Good. We'll be in touch. And don't worry, you'll be well taken care of." As she stood to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger than she could imagine was beginning to unfold. The days that followed felt like a blur. She tried to resume her normal routine, but it was as though she had stepped into a new world where nothing was the same. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Mr. Thompson and the mysterious offer he had made. It wasn't just the idea of a new life that kept her up at night, it was the uncertainty. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was certain, she could never go back to her old life. Then, a week later, she received the first message. It was brief, yet its contents were impossible to ignore. "Meet me at the old warehouse on the edge of town. 3 p.m. tomorrow." The next day, she found herself standing in front of the rusted, abandoned warehouse, the dull afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but she pushed that thought aside as she made her way to the door. Inside, the atmosphere was nothing like she expected. Instead of dark, forgotten corners, the warehouse was alive with activity. Men and women in suits stood around, speaking in low voices, while a few others worked at computers. It was as if the entire place had been transformed into some kind of command center. Mr. Thompson approached her as soon as she stepped inside, his familiar, unreadable expression on his face. "Welcome," he said simply, gesturing for her to follow him. She obeyed without hesitation, her heart pounding in her chest. They passed through a series of hallways, each one more secure than the last, until they reached a large, windowless room at the back of the warehouse. Inside, a huge table was surrounded by more individuals, all dressed in the same sharp suits, their eyes locked on screens displaying various information. "This is where things start," Mr. Thompson said, turning to face her. "You've proven that you can adapt, that you're willing to take a risk. Now, we'll show you what that risk really means." He stepped aside and waved toward the table. "These people are here because they've all made the same choice you've made. They're not just survivors, they're people who have learned to see the world differently. This is the beginning of your new life." The gravity of the situation hit her. This wasn't a simple job or opportunity, it was something far larger. She felt a rush of emotions, both excitement and fear, bubbling up inside her. Could she really be part of something like this? Mr. Thompson continued, "This is a network. We operate behind the scenes, in the shadows. But we have the power to change things, real things. We don't just observe the world, we make decisions that shape it." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "You'll be part of this now. But be warned, the deeper you go, the more difficult it becomes to leave." The warning was clear, yet her mind buzzed with the possibilities. This was not a normal job. She wasn't just joining a company, she was stepping into an entirely new world. And she had no idea what kind of people or forces were behind it, but there was something about the idea of being in control, of influencing things, that was irresistible. "How do I fit into all of this?" she asked, still unsure of her role in this vast operation. "You'll start small," Mr. Thompson replied. "We need people who can handle sensitive tasks. You'll learn as you go. It's not about being the best at something, it's about understanding that nothing in this world is as it seems. You have to be willing to look deeper, to ask the right questions." Her stomach tightened as she thought about what that could mean. What kinds of sensitive tasks would she be handling? She wanted to ask more questions, but something about the way Mr. Thompson spoke, so confident, so calm, made her trust him. Or at least, trust that there was something worth finding out. Over the next few weeks, she was thrust into her new life. Her days became a blur of meetings, assignments, and briefings. She learned quickly that nothing in this world was straightforward. Every task had layers, and there was always something more lurking beneath the surface. The people around her, the ones she worked with, seemed to operate on a level far beyond what she was used to. She found herself staying up late, combing through files and decrypting documents, each one revealing more about the operation she was now a part of. She didn't understand all of it yet, but she could feel that this was something big. Something that could change everything. There were moments of doubt, of course. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her mind racing with the weight of the decisions she was making. But each time, the thought of her old life, of the job she'd lost and the people who'd let her go, gave her the courage to keep going. The real test, she realized, was still ahead. The further she ventured into this world, the more she would be forced to confront her own values and morals. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming. The deeper she delved into her new life, the more she realized that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Every task, every meeting, and every decision she made was laced with complexity. There was always more beneath the surface, always something hidden just out of view. It started innocently enough. Her assignments were vague, and the work felt disconnected from the real world. But it didn't take long for her to notice strange patterns, things that didn't add up. She'd find discrepancies in files, questions that went unanswered, and a general sense of unease whenever she asked about certain projects. At first, she dismissed it. Everyone involved seemed to be so efficient, so professional. She thought maybe it was just her inexperience showing. But as the weeks passed, her doubts grew. There were certain names that kept popping up in conversations, shadowy figures whose presence seemed to haunt the organization. They were never in the room, but their influence was felt everywhere. Every time someone mentioned them, people became more guarded, more cautious. One day, While going through a stack of encrypted documents, she came across something she wasn't meant to see. The file was marked "Top Secret," the kind of label she was told to avoid. But curiosity got the better of her. She opened it. The document was about a covert operation, something far darker and more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. It described a series of illegal activities, things that not only went against the law but also violated ethical boundaries that she had always held dear. It was clear that the organization she had joined wasn't just operating in the shadows, it was pulling the strings behind some of the most powerful events in the world. Her heart pounded in her chest as she read through the details, the weight of the information pressing on her mind. She had stumbled upon something monumental, something that could destroy everything, her new life, the people around her, and even her own future. The more she read, the more she realized the extent of the danger she was in. This was not just about keeping secrets, it was about maintaining control, no matter the cost. And in the world she had entered, lives were expendable. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as the realization set in. If the people in charge found out she had seen this, they wouldn't hesitate to silence her. The same way they had silenced countless others before. She sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She could do nothing with the information, at least, nothing that wouldn't destroy her. But the more she thought about it, the more she understood that she couldn't just walk away from this. This wasn't something she could ignore, no matter the consequences. There were lives at stake, and she had a responsibility now, whether she liked it or not. But how could she expose the truth? Who could she trust? She didn't know enough yet to act, but she knew one thing for certain, she was already too far in. There was no turning back now. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The walls of her apartment suddenly felt too close, the silence too oppressive. She had never felt more alone in her life. It wasn't just the weight of the secret that weighed on her, it was the realization that her entire future was now in the hands of people she couldn't even begin to understand. What had she gotten herself into? The next morning, she received another message from Mr. Thompson. This time, it was different. There were no pleasantries, no vague promises of opportunity. Meet me at the same warehouse. Now. It's time to make a decision. Her stomach churned. The time had come for her to face the consequences of the path she had chosen. There was no turning back. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what awaited her. The warehouse felt colder than usual when she arrived. It was as if the entire place had become more menacing, more like a cage than a meeting point. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, trying to steady her breath. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway as she walked toward the central meeting room. But something was different this time, there was a tension in the air, an unspoken fear that gripped her chest. As she entered the room, she saw Mr. Thompson standing near the far corner, his expression unreadable as always. But his eyes, for the first time, were hard, sharp with something she couldn't place. He didn't greet her like usual. Instead, he just motioned for her to sit. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. She couldn't hide the anxiety that crept into her tone. Mr. Thompson's gaze flickered to the men standing nearby, several faces she had never seen before. They were quiet, but the air between them was thick with suspicion. She felt like she was being sized up, evaluated. "Things are changing," he said finally, his voice colder than usual. "The operation has been compromised." Her heart skipped a beat. "Compromised? What are you talking about?" "Someone's been leaking information," he continued, his tone flat. "And we believe you've been involved in that leak." She froze, unable to process his words. "What? That's not true. I haven't told anyone anything." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't. You've seen something, haven't you? Something that you weren't supposed to know." The shock hit her like a slap. She couldn't believe it. He was accusing her of betrayal, of being the one who had uncovered the truth. "I never meant to dig into anything. I just found something by accident. I didn't know what it meant." "You're lying," Mr. Thompson said, his voice low and threatening. "You've crossed a line. And now, you've put everything at risk." Her breath came faster as fear began to gnaw at her. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The secret she had uncovered was now threatening to destroy her. But it was more than that. She was realizing, with a growing sense of dread, that she wasn't just a participant in this operation anymore. She was a target. Before she could respond, one of the strangers moved forward, blocking her exit. "What are you going to do with her?" the man asked, his tone cold and indifferent. "We'll deal with her later," Mr. Thompson said. "Right now, we need to figure out how deep this breach goes. And you," he turned his gaze back to her, "are going to help us with that." Terror surged through her. She could see it now, there was no helping her, no redemption. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. They were planning to use her, to force her to dig deeper, to uncover things she wasn't ready for. And she knew, deep down, that once she was in this world, there was no getting out. But then, in the midst of her fear, something inside her shifted. She had been pushed to the edge, but this was no longer about survival. It was about control. About taking back her life from these people who thought they could own her, manipulate her. "I'm not doing this," she said suddenly, her voice steadying with newfound resolve. "I'm not helping you anymore." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened, his face twisting with disbelief. "You think you have a choice? You think you can just walk away from this?" She didn't respond, but her mind was already racing. She had to escape. She had no idea how, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The only way out was to run, to disappear, to make sure they never found her. Without another word, she sprang into action. She ducked under the arm of the man blocking her, her heart pounding in her chest as she bolted toward the door. There was no time to think, no time to second-guess herself. Her body moved on instinct, her legs carrying her faster than she ever thought possible. Behind her, she heard shouts, the sound of footsteps chasing her. But she didn't dare look back. The world outside the warehouse was her only chance. The streets felt impossibly long as she ran, but each step made her feel like she was gaining ground. She didn't know where she was going or how far she could run, but she knew one thing: if she didn't escape now, she'd never be free. They would find her, and they would silence her. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a car parked at the curb. She kept going, not stopping for anything, until she saw an alleyway up ahead. She dashed toward it, disappearing into the shadows just as the first of her pursuers appeared at the end of the street. She pressed herself against the cold wall of the alley, praying they wouldn't find her. The adrenaline was still rushing through her veins, but it was mixed with a deep, cold fear. She had made it out, but now came the hard part: surviving. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't want to check it, but a nagging feeling made her pull it out. The message was short, cryptic: "You've made a mistake. You can't outrun this. But there's still time to fix it. If you want to live." Her heart sank as she stared at the words. She had no idea who sent it, but the warning was clear. The game had just changed, and she was running out of time. The message kept buzzing in her pocket, a constant reminder that the danger wasn't over. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything. She had just made a run for her life, and now, this cryptic warning. It was like every step she took was leading her deeper into a labyrinth she didn't understand. And every time she thought she might find a way out, she was pulled further in. She tucked the phone back into her pocket, trying to steady her breathing. She had to think. She couldn't just keep running aimlessly, she needed to figure out what to do next. As the adrenaline began to wear off, her mind turned to the message. You can't outrun this. She shuddered. It was true. She couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would catch up with her, if they hadn't already. But then, just as she was starting to lose hope, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She stiffened, ready to flee again. But this time, the footsteps weren't chasing her, they were coming from a different direction, slow and deliberate. Someone else was in the alleyway with her. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself against the brick wall, trying to remain hidden in the shadows. She dared not move, but her curiosity burned. Who else was out there? Another threat? Or perhaps someone else who was also trying to escape this strange and dangerous world? The footsteps stopped just a few feet away from her hiding spot. She held her breath, waiting. And then, to her surprise, a voice broke the silence. You're not alone. Her eyes widened. The voice was calm, soothing, but there was something else in it, something familiar, something comforting. She couldn't place it, but there was a part of her that recognized it instantly. She stepped out from behind the corner cautiously, just enough to see who was speaking. A man stood before her, tall and unassuming, wearing a plain coat and a slight smile on his face. His eyes were sharp, but there was no malice in them, just an openness, a quiet understanding. Who are you? She asked, her voice hoarse from the tension. My name is David, he said simply, his gaze never leaving hers. And I'm here to help you. She felt a sudden wave of skepticism wash over her. Help? How could he help her? Everyone she had trusted so far had betrayed her. How was this any different? Help, she repeated, the word almost bitter on her tongue. Who are you really? Another agent sent to finish me off? David's smile didn't falter. No, not at all, he said. I'm not here to hurt you. Quite the opposite, actually. I've been watching you, been watching everything that's been happening. I know what you've uncovered. And I know they won't stop until they silence you. The words hit her like a freight train. You've been watching me, she echoed. Who are you? Why should I trust you? I understand your suspicion, David replied, holding his hands out slightly in a gesture of peace. But if you want to stay alive, you need to trust me. I'm not part of their system, but I know how it works. And right now, you're not just a pawn anymore. They want you, and if they can't get you, they'll destroy you. His words rang true, and for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. But there were still so many questions. What was his connection to all of this? How did he know so much about what was happening? And why was he offering her help? Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What's in it for you? David's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something deep, something personal. Because I've been where you are. I've made the mistakes you're about to make. And if I can keep you from falling into the same trap, I will. Her mind raced. Could she trust him? He seemed sincere, but trust had been a luxury she hadn't had in a long time. The people she had trusted had betrayed her. She had no reason to believe he was any different. But there was something about his presence, something about the way he spoke, that made her hesitate. Maybe she was desperate, maybe she was just looking for a lifeline. But she had to admit, there was something comforting about the idea of having someone on her side for once. How do I know you're not part of this? She asked, her voice shaky but determined. David met her gaze, and his eyes were steady. I'm not part of it. But I know how to get you out. I know who you need to talk to. The people at the top, they don't play fair, and they won't stop until they've used you for everything you're worth. But I can show you a way out. A way to turn the tables. She stared at him, weighing his words. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of her decision. Could she trust him? Could she afford not to? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. What do I need to do? David's smile returned, a glimmer of relief in his eyes. We're going to find a way to take them down. But it won't be easy. They'll be watching every move you make. And you'll have to be smart, be careful who you trust. But together, we can do this. For the first time in a long while, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The battle ahead would be long and dangerous, but maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who would stand with her. And in a world where trust had become a foreign concept, that might be enough to change everything. With David's help, she slowly began to piece together the bigger picture. The world she had entered wasn't just filled with shady figures and dangerous people, it was a network, an underground system that controlled everything from politics to business, from media to the stock market. But the most chilling part? It was all connected by one invisible thread: power. People in charge didn't care who they hurt, who they destroyed, as long as they stayed in control. David had been part of this world once, but he had walked away. Now, he spent his days gathering information, looking for people like her, people who had been caught in the gears of this massive operation, people who could be the key to bringing it all down. You're not the first person who's fallen into their trap, David said one night, his voice grim. But you can be the last. Her mind raced with his words. Could she really be the one to expose it all? To take down the very people who had controlled her life for so long? David led her to a small, hidden office beneath an old building. It was cramped, with old computers and files strewn across tables, but it was safe. It was the only place where she could learn the truth without being watched. The truth about everything. The deeper she dug into the files and documents David had gathered, the more she realized the scope of the operation. The people behind her firing weren't just trying to eliminate her, they were trying to eliminate anyone who could pose a threat to their empire. They controlled everything, and they used their influence to manipulate and destroy anyone who dared to stand in their way. But as the truth became clearer, so did her mission. If she could expose this network, if she could tear down the people who had orchestrated her downfall, she could change everything. But she knew the risks, there was no going back once she took this step. No matter how powerful they were, no matter how dangerous the people in charge seemed, she had no choice. David could see it in her eyes. You're ready, he said, his voice steady but filled with caution. But you need to be careful. You're not just fighting for your own life anymore. You're fighting for every life they've ruined. She nodded, feeling a fire ignite inside her. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. About righting the wrongs that had been done, not just to her, but to everyone else who had been crushed under the weight of this corrupt system. David handed her a flash drive. This is the key, he said, his voice low. Everything you need to bring them down is on here. But you have to act quickly. The longer you wait, the more they'll come after you. As she took the drive, her fingers trembling, she realized that this was it. The moment that would define her future. She had the power to change everything, to expose the truth. But it was a dangerous game, and there would be no second chances. You've got this, David said, giving her a reassuring look. Now, go. And don't look back. With the drive securely in her pocket, she made her way to the door. For the first time in months, she felt like she was finally taking control. But there was a weight to it, too. The people behind her firing weren't just powerful, they were ruthless. If they found out what she was about to do, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she knew that the stakes had never been higher. The information on that flash drive could bring them all down, or it could be the end of everything she had fought for. The fight wasn't over yet. In fact, it had just begun. And as she walked into the unknown, she steeled herself for the battle ahead, knowing that the truth had the power to destroy everything, but also the power to set her free. The next few days would be critical. She had to move fast, but she had to be smart. Every step she took from here on out would have consequences. But she was ready to face whatever came next. Because, for the first time in her life, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. She spent the next few days preparing for what was coming. Every minute felt like a lifetime. The flash drive in her possession contained everything she needed: proof, connections, names, dates, everything that would bring down the people who had orchestrated her firing and who controlled so much of the world around her. But with it came immense danger. She had to be careful, calculated. David's words echoed in her mind as she made her plans: "You're not just fighting for your own life anymore. You're fighting for every life they've ruined." It wasn't just about taking revenge anymore, it was about exposing the truth. The world had to know who these people were and what they had done. She couldn't let them destroy any more lives. Not when she had the chance to stop them. But first, she had to get the evidence to the right people. She knew who she had to go to: someone outside of the operation, someone who could help her spread the truth without it getting buried. She couldn't trust anyone inside the system. It had to be someone who was independent, someone who had their own agenda but wasn't tied to the power that ruled over everything. Her heart raced as she reached out to a journalist she knew had been digging into the very network she was now targeting. She'd read his articles before, articles that pointed to corruption but never fully revealed the truth. He had connections, resources, and most importantly, he had the platform to expose the conspiracy to the world. The message she sent was simple but direct: "I have everything you need to take them down. Meet me tonight at the old cafe on Main. Bring no one." She wasn't sure what would happen when they met, but she couldn't waste any more time. The clock was ticking, and she knew the people behind this, those who controlled everything, wouldn't wait long before they came for her. They would be watching every move she made, waiting for her to slip up. But she had a plan. She had to trust that she was doing the right thing, even if it meant risking everything. That night, she sat at the back of the cafe, her eyes constantly darting to the door. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't even know if this journalist would show up. But she couldn't afford to back down now. When the door opened, she tensed, her heart leaping into her throat. A man walked in, scanning the room before locking eyes with her. He was tall, with a slight build, and had an unassuming presence, which made it easier to blend into a crowd. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, made her realize that he wasn't just any journalist. He knew how to get things done. "You're the one with the files," he said, sitting across from her. His voice was steady, but there was a certain wariness in his gaze. "I've been following the story, but you have something else, something bigger. I can tell." Without a word, she slid the flash drive across the table. The journalist's eyes flicked down to it before meeting hers again. "Is this real?" he asked, his tone skeptical but with a hint of excitement. "This is bigger than anything I've seen before." She nodded, trying to suppress the nerves that threatened to rise. "It's all in there. The names, the companies, the operations, they've been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. I'm not just talking about my firing, I'm talking about everything. They've ruined lives, manipulated the system, and nobody's ever questioned them." The journalist took the drive carefully, his expression serious now. "And you want me to expose them?" "Yes," she said. "I've done my part. Now it's your turn. The world needs to know. It's time for the truth to come out." The journalist didn't hesitate. He slipped the flash drive into his laptop and began to review the files. He stayed quiet, scanning through the evidence, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he connected the dots. After what felt like an eternity, he finally looked up at her. It's all here," he said. "Everything. The proof we need to bring them down." Her heart raced as she leaned forward. "Then let's do it. We have to expose them, no matter the cost." He nodded. "We will. But we have to be careful. This kind of exposure isn't just a story, it's a war. These people won't go down easily. They'll fight back, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect their empire. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just taking down a few corrupt people. She was standing at the edge of something much larger. Exposing them would ignite a storm that could destroy everything in its path. But it had to be done. If she didn't do this, no one would. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady now. "Let's bring them down." With that, the journalist began to make plans, contacting his sources and preparing for the story that would shake the foundations of the system. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that they would face opposition every step of the way. But it was too late to turn back now. As the journalist worked, she felt something shift inside her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the day she was fired. She had come full circle. What started as a nightmare, a crushing blow to her life, had turned into an opportunity to change everything. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, who had been hurt by the very system that claimed to protect them. The battle for justice had begun. And this time, she wasn't alone. The days that followed were a blur of urgency and fear. The journalist, whose identity she now trusted completely, worked tirelessly. He reached out to his most trusted colleagues, the ones who could help him verify the evidence and get it into the hands of people who could amplify it, media outlets that had the reach to challenge the power of the people who had once controlled her life. Every move was calculated. They had to be careful, or they'd be caught before they could expose anything. But as the story began to spread, so did the danger. Whispers in the shadows, warning signs that they were being watched, reminders that no one with the kind of power they were up against ever went down without a fight. The heat on her was escalating, she could feel it in her bones. The people she had once feared were beginning to close in, and she knew that exposing the truth might cost her everything, her safety, her future, and even her life. It wasn't just about the conspiracy anymore. It was about the system that had allowed it to thrive, about the lives it had destroyed in the name of power and control. As the story gained momentum, she found herself facing a question that she hadn't anticipated: what would it cost her, personally, to expose these people? The media storm was relentless. As interviews and articles began to flood in, the faces of the powerful, those who had orchestrated her downfall, emerged in the public eye. They were defensive, angry, and desperate. But the more they fought back, the more the public began to see them for who they truly were: manipulative, corrupt, and dangerous. For the first time, she realized that this wasn't just about uncovering a secret. It was about teaching the world a lesson, about standing up to those who thought they were untouchable. It was about showing that one person, no matter how small, could stand against the weight of injustice and make a difference. One evening, as she sat in the quiet aftermath of everything that had unfolded, she received a call from David. His voice, once steady and reassuring, now had a certain heaviness to it. "You did it," he said, but there was no joy in his tone. "You've exposed them. The truth is out there. But they'll never stop coming after you." She stared at the phone in her hand, her mind spinning. She had done it. She had changed the course of her life, exposed a system of corruption that had held so many people captive. But she was also a target now, someone who could never go back to a normal life. The stakes were higher than ever, but there was no fear in her heart anymore. Only the quiet strength that came from knowing that the truth, no matter how painful, was now in the world. "They can come after me all they want," she said, her voice steady. "But they can't take away the truth. And they can't silence me anymore." David paused before speaking again. "The lesson here is that no matter how powerful they are, no matter how high they sit, the truth is always more powerful. It's a force that can't be stopped, not for long. And once it's out, there's no putting it back in. The world will change because of what you've done." She smiled softly, though the weight of it all still sat heavy in her chest. She had come so far, had risked everything, and in the end, she had proven that the system was not as impenetrable as it had seemed. She had exposed its flaws, its greed, its darkness. And in doing so, she had become something more than she ever thought she could be. The woman who had once been fired, dismissed without a second thought, had become the symbol of defiance. She had learned that even when you feel small, when the world seems too big and too powerful, there is always a way to make a difference. And sometimes, that difference comes when you least expect it, but only if you're willing to fight for it. I don't know what the future holds, she said quietly to herself, but I know I'll never be afraid again. The truth is stronger than any fear. And with that, she stepped into the unknown, knowing that no matter what came next, she had already won.